Hey guys, Will here. So this is the most excited I've been for a video for quite some time. Today we're going to be checking out the brand new Simagic Alpha Evo wheelbases. So there's 3 new direct drive wheelbases in this lineup and they all, at least on paper, seem like insanely good value. So we've got the Sport, which is a 9 Newton meter wheelbase that comes in at $399 US. We've got the standard 12 Newton meter, which comes in at $548 US. And then the Pro, which is 18 Newton meters and comes in at $699 US. So those kinds of prices, I think a lot of people are going to be interested in seeing just how good these bases are for the money. So what we're going to be doing in today's video is all kinds of things. We're going to be comparing the bases against each other to see which one we think is the best value for money within this range. We're going to be comparing them against the older Simagic Alpha bases as well to see exactly where the differences are, and of course comparing them against the competition too. So by the end of today's video, regardless of whether you're looking at buying your first direct drive wheelbase or maybe looking at upgrading or changing from something else, you should have a much better picture of whether a Simagic Alpha Evo base is going to be the right one for you. So without further ado, let's dive into this new range. So before we get started today, firstly, a big thank you to our sponsor, Trophy AI. Now, one of the complaints that I see come up time and time again in sim racing is I'm practicing and practicing and practicing, and I'm just not finding myself getting any faster. Now, practicing with intent is something that is extremely important to save yourself a whole bunch of time and see results more quickly. And that's where Trophy AI can really help. So what it allows you to do is analyze telemetry based on your own on-track performance and compare that against other professional drivers to see exactly where you might be losing time on the track. But it also has a really cool built-in AI voice feature, which actually gives you turn-by-turn feedback as you drive around the circuit to let you know what you might be doing wrong and where you could potentially be improving. So I tested this out recently and did find that it genuinely made a difference to my driving, did allow me to acclimatize to a new track more quickly and find time on tracks that I was already very familiar with. So if that sounds like something that you might want to check out, there's some links down in the description box below. There is a 7-day obligation-free trial available as well. So if you want to just check it out and see whether it's right for you before committing to it, you can do that as well. And yeah, thank you very much to Trophy AI for sponsoring this part of today's video. Okay, so we've got a lot of stuff to get through in today's video, but firstly, as always, a couple of housekeeping things just so you have the full context of exactly what we're doing in today's video. So firstly, big thank you to Simagic for supplying us with these 3 bases for review purposes. They did also send us a bunch of their accessories, which we'll be covering in today's video as well. Also want to give a quick shout out to Sim Rigs here in Australia as well. They've helped supply us with local stock just to get the ball rolling a lot more quickly. So we really appreciate their support too. Now, one of the things that we like to do here at Boosted Media is cross-compare the product that we're reviewing against other competitor products that we've also reviewed to give you a better understanding of what might suit you best. So it's important that you guys are aware that every product that we'll be referencing in today's video was all sent to us under the exact same conditions. Now, if you do decide you want to pick up any of the gear that you see in today's video or any other sim racing gear for that matter, head over to boostedmedia.net or jump down in the description box below this video. There you'll find a whole bunch of affiliate links and discount codes, which is an awesome way of saving yourselves a little bit of money and helping us out in the process as well. So we really do appreciate your support there. But with all that said, let's dive in now and take a more detailed look at these Simagic Alpha Evo bases. Now, compatibility wise, unfortunately, at the time of filming at least, these are only PC compatible. Now, historically, Simagic have offered third-party compatibility for PlayStation and Xbox through a third-party device called a Sigma Cortex. Unfortunately, these devices, at least at the time of filming, aren't compatible with the Sigma Cortex. Now, apparently they are working on a solution, but of course, being a third-party compatibility tool, there is no guarantee there. So if you are looking for something that has native Xbox or PlayStation compatibility, I would certainly recommend looking elsewhere at this point in time. So starting off with pricing here, I already quickly mentioned this in the intro, but let's go through it again in a little bit more detail. So the Sport comes in at 9 Newton meters and $399 US. The Evo comes in at 12 Newton meters of strength at $549 US, and the Pro comes in at 18 Newton meters of strength at $699 US. Now, to dig into that in a little bit more detail, obviously you will need to factor in things like shipping costs, import duties, and whatnot when you are looking at buying one of these things. Now, different brands handle these sorts of things differently, so it is important to do your own research there. Simagic, just like a lot of other brands, do have a really well-established distribution network around the world now, so it is worth just shopping around. We do have some affiliate partners around the world linked down in the description below, so make sure you check those out. But yeah, definitely make sure you do your own research there. Don't just assume that even with a discount code, you will be getting the best possible price. Do have a look at your local resellers just to make sure you are getting the best possible deal here. Now, I don't want to get completely bogged down here in comparing every single base on the market in terms of price, because we'll literally literally be here all day if we do that. But what we have done is, as part of our direct drive buyer's guide over on boostedmedia.net, we've put together a bit of a comparison chart for you guys. And what that basically does is list value for money, just to give you a quick point of reference so you can see how things fall within the market. Now, of course, I hope that you guys understand that strength certainly isn't everything when it comes to what a wheelbase is actually like to drive with. When direct drive first came out, it was a bit of a race to the top. Everybody sort of wanted to have the biggest number. And then people started to figure out over time that, you know, beyond a certain point at least, if as long as you've got enough dynamic range there to generate the effects that you want to feel, anything beyond that sort of starts to become a little bit irrelevant. And you can very easily fall into the trap of spending more money than you perhaps needed to get the best driving experience for you personally. But there's all sorts of different things that ultimately determine what a wheelbase is going to feel like to drive with. So let's spend some time now talking about exactly what you are getting for the money here and what actually sets these apart from some other wheelbases on the market in terms of their design. And then we'll get into the software and ecosystem. That is becoming an increasingly important factor when it comes to choosing the best ecosystem for you these days. And if you saw my direct drive buyer's guide video from last year, you'd know exactly the reasons why, but we'll talk about that as we go through today's video. So we will talk about some of the hardware features and how they influence the driving experience as we go through today's video. And then we'll summarize everything at the end with my overall driving impressions and my recommendations, not only within this ecosystem, but how it compares to competitor products as well. So what are we actually getting here in terms of hardware? So we already talked about the Newton meters of strength for each, 9, 12, and 18. Important to note first up that that is a continuous torque level, so not a peak. That means that it's able to produce those forces consistently without falling off over time. Now, in their marketing materials, they made a big deal about the fact that they actually designed the motors being used in these bases in-house. They're using a 5-pole servo motor, and specifically they focused on the low inertia characteristics of these motors. And what that's essentially meaning is that in all cases, when you rotate these motors, when they're not energized, the shaft itself does actually feel very light. So there's not a lot of inertia there or a lot of rotating mass when you rotate the wheel. So low rotating mass is going to mean that a smaller, less powerful motor will be able to maintain a higher level of responsiveness compared to something that weighs more, all other things being equal, essentially. So, you know, there are different types of direct drive motors. We've done other videos talking about some of the characteristics between different types, but these are using a more conventional servo style motor. Now, in terms of how that actually relates to the driving experience, obviously it's going to be somewhat dependent on the wheel that you have connected. Obviously, we tested these across, you know, every single type of different steering wheel to make sure we were getting the full experience across everything. And I can certainly say that in all cases, all three of these bases were punching above their weight in terms of how responsive they feel compared to other bases that cost around the same kind of level as this. And even in some cases more responsive than some other bases that cost a lot more money. So say, for example, comparing the 9 Newton meter to the CSL DD with the boost pack, for example, this actually feels more responsive and more granular in detail than the CSL DD does, despite being quite a bit cheaper. And we will unpack some of those characteristics as we get on through today's video. Now, I just want to quickly grab the old Simagic Alpha here as well, and we'll put that on the side here too. Now, comparing here, you can feel there is a lot more rotating mass, and obviously we don't really have any way to relay that, but you can take my word for it here. As I rotate the shaft here, that feels a lot heavier, and it feels like there's a lot more resistance there than spinning any one of these guys. Now, it's important to note as well that the Sport and the Standard are mechanically identical as far as I can tell. My understanding is that the difference between these is purely just down to the firmware. We are seeing that across quite a number of other brands these days as well. VRS more recently moved across to an unlocking system where you can actually, you know, buy the base and then unlock higher torque levels down the track later on if you wish to do so. I don't know whether they're going to offer something similar to that for the Sport model, but yeah, mechanically they do appear to be identical to each other. Now, the other big thing that I noticed immediately was that the amount of cogging or torque ripple that you feel through these new bases is a lot less than what you feel on a lot of other bases at this kind of price point, particularly CSL DD and Moser bases, for example, although the Moser bases have gotten a lot smoother in terms of the driving experience with later firmware revisions. And again, I did go back through and test pretty much everything again with the latest firmware and software just to make absolutely sure that I was, you know, making it as even a playing field and as fair as I possibly could in doing these comparisons. Spent pretty much all of last week doing that. So with the bases energized, there's all sorts of clever things that you can do in software to counteract the effects of torque ripple or cogging. And what I mean by that is as you rotate the shaft, you can actually feel the interface between the magnets and the coil. And as it goes across each segment, there's a bit of a sort of jump to the next one. So you feel a difference in the mechanical resistance as you rotate the wheel. And you'll remember with the very early direct drive wheelbases, that was something that you felt in the driving experience as well. So if you rotated the wheel, even with the base energized, you would actually feel that torque ripple or that cogging effect as you went through. And it sort of took away from the realism to a certain extent. It wasn't typically something that was absolutely immersion breaking when driving, but it was definitely noticeable if you paid attention to it. And that was something that we were critical about with some of the early SIMAGIC bases, particularly the old M10. If you remember, that had a very distinct kind of underpinning sensation of torque ripple all the time that you were driving with it. And things have definitely improved across the board pretty much in every single brand since then. So yeah, as I was saying, there's all sorts of things that you can do in firmware and software to sort of counteract the sensation of torque ripple or cogging. But having to do that at a firmware or software level is obviously, you know, trying to make up for some of the not necessarily inadequacies, but some of the trade-offs for using a certain style of motor in order to keep costs down. And you'll notice that if you go and grab something like a SIMUcube 2 Sport Pro or Ultimate, those are completely smooth even when the motor's not energized. Now these guys aren't quite as smooth non-energized as those bases are, but once these three are energized, they are completely smooth in rotation. So long story short, what that tells me is that the motors that they've used in these three bases is more suited to sim racing compared to the motor that they've used in something like this, where they have to use firmware and software mitigation techniques to, you know, get around that torque ripple. So look, in terms of the actual driving experience, again, look, the Alpha is, you know, smooth. It's not like this is a massive upgrade, but underneath the skin, these are the kinds of things that lead to a better overall driving experience, because you're not having to make the same trade-offs in terms of, you know, having to deal with more inertia, more rotating mass, torque ripple and things like that. And the end result is a noticeably improved driving experience across all three of these bases overall. It isn't a massive difference, but we'll talk about that more when we get into our comparisons a little bit later on. So a couple other things to quickly mention here as well. All three of these bases are using a 21-bit resolution encoder. So you can imagine 2,100,000 or thereabouts steps as you rotate through 360 degrees. So what that means for the driving experience compared to a base that uses a lower resolution encoder is that the base is more accurately able to determine exactly where it is in space and make adjustments you know, accordingly. So, you know, if you were to compare that to a really low resolution encoder that had, say, maybe like 1,000 steps around the outside, something like that's going to feel a lot more robotic in your hands because it's not able to pinpoint so precisely exactly where it's going to move to. So it's going to sort of jump to the next spot. So obviously, you know, 1,000 points of resolution is just a random number that I've picked here. You can do your own research as to the resolution of the various different bases that you might be interested in. But I can certainly say that in the driving experience, there was no hint of roboticness to any of these three bases. And, you know, some of that could potentially be attributed to the higher resolution encoder that they're using, along with, of course, the other characteristics that we've already discussed. So let's spend some time now having a look at the physical design of these new bases. Now, we've only got the Evo standard on the desk at the moment. As you guys saw, the Sport is mechanically identical to this. The Pro is just a little bit longer and heavier, and I'll put the dimensions of all three of them up on the screen for you now, including weights, so you guys can see for yourselves. But I wanted to just sort of do a side-by-side with the Alpha here so you guys get a better sense of, you know, what's changed. So the first thing you're probably going to notice straight away, and I certainly noticed straight away, is the lack of a front mount on these new bases. Now, I think personally that this is a bit of a mistake. Look, there are a couple of reasons why they've done this. You may notice the little contact pads along the front here. Those are going to be for additional accessories down the line. I believe things like dashboards and so forth, but unfortunately we don't have any of those things at the moment to show you. So that's one reason why you might not want to front mount this thing. There's also an LED ring around here as well. We'll put some footage up for you now, which is able to respond to telemetry inside the game. So you can have it light up with the flags, for example, so green flag, yellow flag, white flag, and so forth. You can also have it flash when ABS or traction control activate, for example, as well. So I'll take you through all the various things that you can do with that later on when we take a look at the software, of course. So look, that is relatively close to the shaft here. So, you know, even front mounting is probably not going to interfere with that anyway, because you can see on the old Alpha, this whole section here where the step is would be the part that was actually poking through the front of the housing anyway. So yeah, no front mount in the actual base itself. Now they do have available as an optional accessory these front mount adapters. So essentially what these do is they bolt in on either side, like so, using the mounting holes on the side, and I'll put the dimensions of those up on the screen for you as well. And that then gives you your front mount. So that is a solution. Of course, that does come at an additional expense as opposed to, you know, just having it built into the wheelbase. It also does introduce a couple of additional points where flex can be introduced into the system. So you've got the ability for flex to occur between these two, as well as flex to occur where this is actually bolting to the side of your rig. So ultimately, it is good that they have a solution, but I do feel like it's a mistake moving away from the, you know, tried and tested front mount. The other issue that this does introduce is it does add additional width to the base. So you will find that with some front mounts, and we found this with the P1X Pro front mount from SimLab, for example, it ends up being too wide to actually fit within the front mount bracket for that. So you end up having to turn the base sideways and have your mounts at the top and bottom to work around that. And while you can, of course, recalibrate the base so it is correctly centered, that is going to mean that the contact pads for the dash are going to be, you know, rotated 90 degrees, which is just not going to work at all. So look, ultimately, in my opinion, at least, any time that you're taking away a feature and requiring the purchase of an additional accessory or adapter to give you that feature back, you know, that's going to be something that's going to annoy some people. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. So lack of front mount aside, we do still have the same mounting holes on the sides and the underside as what we had with the Simagic Alpha. So we'll flash the measurements up on the screen for you now, but the mounting holes underneath are the exact same mounting pattern as the standard Fanatec mount. So long story short, any bottom mount wheel deck that's compatible with the Simagic Alpha will also be compatible with the Alpha Evo. But you can see it is a very clean design overall, and I'd say it's definitely a big step up from Simagic here. You'll remember if you go back to the M10, for example, that was a very bootleg kind of style design. When we started to pull that thing apart to take a look at the inside, screws were falling out, for example. There were missing screws. There were screws that were kind of just glued in place and not actually screwed into anything. And it was just overall a pretty poor experience. Back then, it was, you know, you could argue that it was acceptable for the price because there wasn't a lot of other competition available. But these days, you wouldn't be able to get away with something like that without some, you know, people just going and buying something else. Now, you know, obviously the Alpha and the Alpha Mini were, you know, a step up from that kind of quality. But look, they still feel a little bit bootleg compared to what we have here now. This is all nicely branded. You can see even just little subtle things like the fact that we've got a Simagic logo on the nose of the quick release now, as opposed to just the generic PCB that we have on the front of the older style design. Little details like that do make a big difference, in my opinion, as to how premium the product feels overall. So you've got a nice cast aluminium housing here. This front bezel here is plastic. There is a plastic housing on the rear as well, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. In fact, let's actually spin the bases around now quickly. We'll talk about inputs and outputs, and then we'll come back and talk in a little bit more detail about the quick release in just a moment. So if we take a look at the old Simagic Alpha, you've got your DC jack for input there. You've got your USB-B connection here for connecting through to your PC. And then on the right-hand side here, you've got your accessory port and your USB CAN bus. You'll notice straight away on the back of the Alpha Evo, we've got a lot more going on here. And this is the same across all three models. You've got a little power button here now, which you didn't used to have on the old model. So that does mean that you can put the device into standby without having to reach down or switch it off at the wall if you wish to do so. Now that's not a latching button, so it is just a momentary press to activate or put the device in standby. You've got your DC jack input there as well. No complaints about that. It is a nice sturdy connection. It doesn't click into place. So, you know, there's the good side of that is that if you step on the cable, it's not going to tear the connection off the PCB internally. The bad side of that is that if you bump it, you can potentially unplug it while you're driving. But, you know, the likelihood of that happening is pretty slim. These days, I think I have actually done a 180 on that, and I would prefer, given the number of people we see damaging the connections on some other wheelbases, I think it's better to have things be able to just pull out rather than have to be unclipped to avoid damage. Next to that, you can see 3 USB-A ports. Now, I was really hoping that this would just operate as a generic USB hub. I did try it by plugging in a mouse, which is the way I usually test these kinds of things. And unfortunately, I was able to confirm that this does only support a CAN signal output. So it is going to be for connecting specific types of devices. There isn't a specific list on exactly what is supported. The good news there is that it does have a voltage across it. So it will supply 5 volts. So if you do have some sort of a 5-volt DC low current USB powered device that you want to plug in there just for power, you can potentially do so, but I can't guarantee that you won't overload the base by doing that. So yeah, do that at your own peril. On the left-hand side of that, you can see 8 RJ45 connections. Now, there are a few little details here to be aware of. They don't all do exactly the same thing. So we'll flash up on the screen for you now a bit of a chart. The top left and then the entire bottom row are output interface number 1, and this supports CAN FD. So CAN FD is very similar to standard CAN bus, but flexible data rate. So it is able to support higher data rates. So some of the new peripherals that will be coming out, or potentially some of the ones that are already out, I'm not 100% certain on that, will support those ports specifically. The 2 RJ ports in the middle at the top support both USB signal output as well as CAN FD. Now, obviously they don't look like a standard USB port. So again, I'm not 100% certain on exactly what devices are supported there, but hopefully they'll update their website with some details to let you know exactly what you should be plugging in where. And then finally on the top right, we've got another port which supports both CAN FD as well as the Simagic emergency stop button, which unfortunately isn't included with any of these bases, is available as an optional accessory. So then over on the left-hand side of that, we've got a USB-B port. That is for connecting the base to your PC, just like any other wheelbase. And then below that, you can also see a USB-C port. Now, I'm a little bit confused about this one. What I found was that I had to have this connected to my PC in order for the USB pass-through to the QRA to work for connecting other peripherals through that. Their explanation for that is that it's a third-party USB interface for steering wheels and USB enhanced input interfaces. So that seems to match with what my observations were. And that covers everything that you'll find in terms of inputs and outputs on the back of the base. And again, that is a big step up from what we had on the Alpha models previously, and definitely more expandability there than we see with most other brands. So let's talk a little bit more about the quick release now. So you'll notice that it is the same D-Spec style quick release that we find on all other Simagic bases, as well as Moza bases. And that is actually the same style of quick release that you'll find in a lot of real life race cars as well. So a tried and tested platform that's, we've never had any complaints ourselves or really seen any major complaints from anybody else in the many years now that that's been in use. So yeah, no problems at all there. And, having been used in the real life motorsport world for so long now, it's, tried and tested. It's never likely to give anybody any major problems. Now, you may notice in the front here, there is a slight difference, or maybe not so slight difference, between the physical connections that you have on the new bases and the old Simagic Alpha. Now, this is where things do get a little bit messy, unfortunately. Going back to the Simagic M10 wheelbase again, that's actually used a wireless connection through to the base. It was using some sort of a proprietary Bluetooth protocol, if I remember correctly. And I remember we did have quite a few issues with that back in the day. They then moved across to the second generation wheels like the Simagic Neo, for example, that we have here. And you'll notice this has actually got a lot of pins on the connection internally here. So my understanding at least is that these were actually passing data and power through that connection there into the wheelbase. So there wasn't a wireless connection, which meant that they were a lot more reliable. I'm not 100% certain on that, but that was my understanding. But certainly with these new Evo bases, they are now using a slip ring design internally to allow data and power to pass through to the motor stem and rotate infinitely without cables coiling up. Now, a couple of other brands do some other things with regards to that. So if you've been around the channel long enough to remember our Fanatec DD1, DD2 teardown video, you'll remember there was an optical transceiver inside those bases that allowed the data to be transmitted between the wheel and the base without cables coiling up. So yeah, it's all changed a little bit these days. Asetek also used a slip ring design very similar to this. Simucube is still using a wireless system, or you have to plug the wheel in directly via USB. But yeah, essentially what that means is that you're able to pass data and power through to your wheel. No need for any other sort of wireless connection. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. One thing that we have noticed is that with these new Evo bases, the Sim Hub features of Simagic's wheels don't work natively through that connection. You will still need to make use of the MagLink cable and connect it directly through to your PC to allow those features to work through SimHub. Now, they have told me that they are working on that. The wheels do have a way of determining whether they're connected via the quick release or via the magnetic connection. And in future firmware updates and software revisions, there should hopefully be a way for that to work, so you won't have to use that connection. But as it stands right now, at the time that we're making this video, unfortunately, those SimHub features don't work on the Simagic wheels unless you have a physical USB connection directly between the wheel and your PC. So just be aware of that if you are looking at buying one of these immediately. That will be potentially a limitation that you'll find yourself up against. So a couple other quick observations with regards to the quick release before we have a look at the internals. You'll notice these two little shiny spots here on the front, which aren't present on the old Alpha. These are magnets, and they do marry up with the two opposing sides here on the QRA. Now, of course, their older wheels don't have the opposing sides, so it's not going to make any difference there, but with their newer wheels moving forward, that does just allow a little bit more of a sturdy connection in there. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference, but obviously there must be a reason why they've done it. I thought at first maybe power's being delivered that way, but I put a multimeter across those two magnets and there was no voltage measured, so I don't believe they're doing that. Other thing they've done here, which is quite interesting to me, is you'll notice now this entire piece is actually spring-loaded. So there's a little spring mechanism behind here, and that's going to mean that there's going to be less abrasion on this PCB over time. If you go back over to the old Alpha, you can see that doesn't move around at all. So forces being applied to that PCB will be more abrasive on the contacts over time. Now, admittedly, on the wheel side, they are using spring-loaded pogo pins, so it's not like you ever really saw major wear. You can see this base, which has had quite significant use, doesn't have any signs of wear and tear at all. But yeah, little subtle details like that do go a long way overall to giving the impression of a more high quality, more refined product. So definitely happy to see that. Now, just before we wrap things up with regards to the quick release, one other thing that I think is really important just to call out here, because it's definitely a really important consideration if you're looking at getting into a direct drive wheelbase for the first time. The barrier to entry here in terms of costs, if you're wanting to add additional wheels to your rig, is a lot lower with SIMAGIC and Moser than it is with a lot of other brands because of that D1 style quick release. Now, if you compare it to, say, Fanatec, for example, they actually lock out their ecosystem, so you have to use either an emulator or one of their own branded hubs to allow you to actually use any other wheel with their bases. Otherwise, if you try to just connect it directly, you won't have any force feedback because the base actually detects whether it has a genuine wheel connected or not. Acertec do a pretty good job with their quick release system as well in terms of allowing it to be relatively open. They have adapters available to connect pretty much any wheel you want through to their bases. But unfortunately, the cost there, at least at the time that we're making this video, is quite high. You're looking at quite a significant additional cost to buy a wheel side quick release for every single wheel that you're wanting to connect through to your Acertec wheelbase. Now, when it comes to SIMAGIC and Moser, for example, because you've got that D1 quick release, those are relatively speaking very cheap and easy to get your hands on. You can just buy them off Amazon. So provided that you're not trying to mount a wheel that requires some sort of power connection, data connection through the base, if you're just wanting a way to physically mount it onto the wheelbase and then deal with the connection through to your PC separately, then that is very easy and relatively cheap with both SIMAGIC and Moser. So again, the reason I call that out is because in some other ecosystems, you are looking at a very significant additional cost if you're wanting to add other third-party wheels and use them with your wheelbase. So definitely worth considering, particularly if you're looking at buying a direct drive base for the first time. Now, another accessory that I'll just quickly show you here is the QRA from SIMAGIC. Now, this is an early prototype that we have here. It looks pretty nice and clean and final, but they have told me that there will be some changes to how this is designed before the final production. But essentially what this is allowing you to do is, just like within the Acertec ecosystem, allows you to have a quick release which you can mount on and off without having to have a physical cable between your wheel and your PC. And it has a little USB port on the bottom here, which will allow you to connect any third-party wheel you want. So back cover's removed off all three bases. Now we've got the Sport, the Standard, and the Pro here. Now, I expected to find that the Standard and the Sport would be mechanically identical. We talked about that before, and that is indeed the case, even down to exactly the same processor used in both cases. What I was a little bit surprised about is that the motherboard on the Pro is actually identical as well. The gauges of the wiring is all the same internally. The ratings on the capacitors, the braking resistor, everything is all identical here to what we found on the other two. Now, that's obviously not to say that the Pro is mechanically identical to the other two, because obviously it's using a more powerful, larger motor. But yeah, otherwise all the driver circuitry does appear to be exactly the same, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. But let's set the Pro and the Sport aside now, and we'll take a more detailed look at exactly what we have on the Standard. So there are a couple of interesting points of observation here. First thing I'm always looking for whenever I have a look inside of something is just the general quality of the solder joints, whether there's any excessively long cables, pinched cables, any opportunity for anything to short or anything obvious like that. And happy to report there's nothing here that concerns me whatsoever with all my electronics background. All the surface mount components that we see here are all, of course, wave soldered, and even pass-through mounted components like this electrical header here. That actually looks to me like it's been machine soldered. It's very, very clean, with minimal flux or anything like that surrounding the joint. So yeah, no concerns there whatsoever with regards to build quality. In terms of actual observations, there's a couple of things to point out here. So first thing that I noticed is there is a little wireless module here. I'm not sure whether it's Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or both. So I don't know whether this is a legacy thing for communicating with older wheels that did have that wireless system that we were talking about. But yeah, little wireless module there, which I thought was quite interesting. The electrical header that we were talking about just before is connected to these two high temperature braided cables, which actually passes through to our braking resistor underneath the unit. We've got our three electrical connections here for our motor phases. So those three connections there are what's powering the actual motor inside the housing. And just like what we see with SimiCube, for example, if you look at our reviews of those are screw-on terminal type connections with a ring style lug connection for each one. So plenty of current capability there. We're not relying on some sort of a flimsy little connection or soldered connections that could get brittle and break over time or anything like that. So yeah, nice high quality connections there. Speaking of thermal management, moment. If we spin around on the side now, this is the active cooling that we were talking about just before. Now, admittedly, I never actually heard this fan running at all on any of the 3 bases. Even when we ran them for extended periods of time at their maximum torque level, never actually heard these fans running. But this is a blower style cooler, similar to what you would find inside a laptop computer, for example. And essentially what this is doing is just drawing air through the housing. We never actually heard the thing running, and we never had any issues with overheating or drop off in performance or anything like that. So no concerns there whatsoever, but that is the little blower fan there, just like what you would find in a laptop computer, as I said before. So then moving down from here, we've got a couple of capacitors. You can see the power button, the DC jack for power input, our USB connections and our RJ connections that we were talking about before, USB-B input there, and our USB-C connection. Nice high quality metal standoffs here, which are what the housing actually screws into. So we're not screwing into plastic or anything like that. Yeah, really just no concerns here in terms of quality whatsoever. Let me just flip it up on its side here as well quickly. And you'll notice inside there, if you can see on camera, there's a little area that looks like copper or gold. That's actually where we'll find our 21-bit encoder that we were talking about a little bit earlier on in today's video. So you'll notice as I rotate the motor shaft, you can actually see that whole assembly spinning. So that shaft is passing all the way through the center. Now there's a little magnet on the back of that, and there's a Hall effect sensor on the PCB. You won't be able to see it really on camera, I don't think. But yeah, there's a little tiny Hall effect sensor soldered to the front of that PCB. And as I rotate the shaft, the variance in magnetic field is what that encoder is actually using to determine the physical position of the rotation. So there's no physical contact there, nothing to wear out over time. Exactly the same design that we're seeing in most high-end wheelbases these days. So nothing of concern there. If we rotate it around again, you'll notice the little braking resistor that we were talking about before. So you can see the 2 braided cables passing through the PCB down here and then into that braking resistor. And again, that is exactly the same braking resistor that we're seeing across all 3. Essentially what that's responsible for is dealing with any sort of overrun or overshoot. So if I grab the Alpha base up here again, just as an example for you guys, one thing you might have noticed with these is as we rotate the shaft, even when it's not plugged in, notice how the power light turns on. And what that's essentially doing is using the motor like a generator or a dynamo. So as we rotate the motor, it's actually generating an electrical current, which then sends power through into the components. So when you're under normal driving conditions, the motor actually does generate electricity as it's turning, and that can actually cause some overrun or some weird behavior if you don't have a braking resistor to actually deal with it. So what that's essentially doing is managing any electrical current that's being generated by you turning the wheel or just the natural inertia of the wheel and bleeding it off as heat. So nothing unusual there. Any direct drive wheelbase, you're going to see something similar, but just wanted to highlight that as well in case you were wondering exactly what it was. And yeah, look, I mean, as I said before, there's absolutely nothing here in terms of cause for concern or anything like that. It is a sealed unit in terms of the motor housing itself. I was hoping I might be able to pull it apart a little bit further. If I flip it over its head here, you'll notice the little bolts here that go in, but I don't want to remove the PCB from the back of this because that Hall effect sensor that we were talking about before is extremely sensitive. And if I don't align this PCB exactly the same way as it was before, I could potentially cause issues, and I definitely don't want to be doing that. But there are a couple of exploded views available through Simagic's marketing materials. So we'll flash a couple of those up on the screen for you now so you get a better sense of what the actual internals of the motor itself look like. But yeah, from my perspective here, absolutely nothing that I'm concerned about whatsoever. Everything looks to be very high quality. The manufacturing process all looks very good. And look, honestly, I'll go as far as to say that I think it's actually better than what I was expecting to see at this kind of a price point compared to what we've seen from other manufacturers at a similar price point. So yeah, very impressed. Let me just quickly show you around on this side as well. You'll notice a couple of physical connections here. Those cables that are passing into the motor housing are what actually run through and will provide power and data to our pin header for the dashes we were talking about before, as well as of course the quick release on the front for data and power delivery to and from the wheel. So that is a quick rundown on the internals. Again, as far as the PCB on the back is concerned, exactly the same across all 3 bases. And I think that's everything that we need to look at in terms of the physical hardware. So let's now take a look at the software ecosystem side of things and then wrap things up with our overall driving impressions. So this is the Simagic Sim Pro Manager software, and it's going to be responsible for managing any of the Simagic peripherals that are connected to your PC. So those of you who already own some Simagic gear would already be familiar with the software. There are a couple of things that are a little bit different with these new Evo bases though. So we'll take you through everything so today so you have all the details. But for those who aren't familiar, you've got some tabs down on the left-hand side here. You've got your home tab, which gives you a quick rundown on the peripherals that are connected to your PC currently. So you can see we've got the wheelbase, the steering wheel, our P500 pedals, which we will be reviewing here soon on the channel, our DS8 shifter, and our hydraulic handbrake connected. If we click down onto individual devices, this is going to give us a rundown of the individually selected device, and you can click between the various different devices down here to adjust the settings pertaining to that particular thing. And you can see there are a couple of other peripherals here that aren't currently connected, which would show up if we had those things connected to our PC. Down below that, we have some settings for individual games, so you can set up profiles pertaining to those specific games if you want to. We've got an FAQ section here, and also just some global settings here which manage how the software behaves on your PC. You can see here I've got it set to hide Sim Pro to tray when we close the software, rather than close it completely, but you can have it automatically launch when you launch Windows, start in minimize, auto check for updates. And then you've also got the update tab here, which, as you can see, will tell you whether or not everything is up to date. So if we click back on the home tab now, as I mentioned before, we've got little sections here for each of the peripherals connected to our PC. We're going to click on the Alpha Evo Sport here now, and that is going to open up the settings pertaining to that particular device, like what we saw before. So we've got the bass selected down here. If we were to click on pedals, it would take us through our pedal settings and so forth. Now, you will notice if you already own an Alpha bass, there are a couple of new settings here. We've got a new filter level adjustment and a new dynamic prediction level adjustment. Now, of course, one of the things that we did do in our testing was plug in one of the old basses, make sure that it was fully updated with the latest software, latest firmware, and see what the driving differences were between the two. And we'll obviously cover that when we get into driving experience in just a moment. But I was also interested to see whether these new settings had also been added for those older basses. And I can tell you, running latest firmware and driver software as of the time of recording this video, they weren't available on those older basses, but that's not to say that they won't potentially be added into the future. So I will try to clarify that for you guys and let you know down in the comments below. But as it stands right now, these new settings are only available on these new basses. So let's go through everything that we have here methodically and give you a better understanding of what everything does. Now, one of the things I'm really happy about here is that it is quite approachable, quite easy to use, and all the settings kind of make sense. You've got little tooltips next to everything as well, which are written in plain English and explain to you exactly what each setting does and the impact that it's actually going to have on the driving experience, which I think is really important. Quite often we see these tooltips that kind of explain in engineering terms what the setting does, but it doesn't actually tell you what impact that's going to have on your driving, which is really what you guys care about. So really good to see that they've put some effort into that. So over on the left-hand side here, we've got our steering settings. We've got our basic angle adjustment here, which is just the sensitivity. We can adjust that from 360 degrees or lower, so you can go all the way down to 90 degrees if you wanted to, all the way up to 2,520 degrees. So if you're driving a truck sim or something like that, you're not going to have any problems using this base. We're going to set that back to 900 for now. Hard lock angle. So this is going to be the angle where you feel the soft bump stop. So when you rotate past that point, it's going to lock the wheel. Now, direct drive wheelbases don't have a mechanical bump stop or a mechanical hard limit to their rotation. So it is important that that is set appropriately. So as it stands right now, we've got 900 degrees selected for our steering angle, which means that it will report through to the sim 900 degrees of rotation. Now, if for some reason we want to have our hard lock angle lower than our steering angle, which I can't really think of a scenario where you might want to do that, you can actually decouple these two settings. So if we set that to 90 degrees, so now you can see I only get 90 degrees of rotation before I hit that soft bump stop, even though it can actually mechanically read past that point. So we're going to set that back to 900 now, and you'll notice that if we do set it to 360, that is automatically going to jump to 360 as well. So you can't have a scenario where you wind the hard lock angle beyond what's the angle will actually be reported into the sim, if that makes sense. Now you can also change the bump stop strength here as well. Of course, as we said before, being a soft bump stop rather than a physical mechanical bump stop, you can adjust that. So if we go soft, it feels a lot softer when you hit those ends. Normal, pretty self-explanatory, and firm is a lot stiffer when you get to the side. So I just like to run that on normal. I think that is absolutely fine. And let's set our rotation back to 900 degrees again. So then we get into our basic settings. First one here is force feedback strength. Now this is the total dynamic range available on the wheelbase. So if you wind that all the way up, as we probably would want to do on the Sport, we have the full 9 Newton meters of dynamic range available. Now, if you are finding that that is just too strong, if you've got a small child running on your rig or something like that, you can limit that by winding it down, and that is going to mean that under the most most extreme circumstances, the maximum amount of torque you're ever going to feel is going to be limited to whatever you set this to. So under most scenarios, particularly with weaker wheelbases, what I would generally recommend is have this wound all the way up so you have the full physical dynamic range available, and then wind down your game force feedback. And then that's going to allow you to make use of the full dynamic range without clipping where necessary, but also have the force feedback feeling at a level that you're comfortable with. On the more strong bases, so like the Pro, for example, you're going to want to limit the maximum dynamic range to whatever you're comfortable with. So if you find that anything stronger than about 14 Newton meters, for example, is just too strong for you, even under crash scenarios, then you can limit that to that point to make sure that you're keeping things safe. You're not going to give yourself an injury. So that is a quick explanation of force feedback strength there, not to be confused with the output of the game, of course. This is the maximum dynamic range available. So you can almost think of it like a master gain control for your wheelbase, or a master volume control. So then below that, we've got one of our new settings, filter levels. So 0 indicates off, functioning to filter out high frequency noise and smooth the signal. The larger the value, the smoother it becomes, but excessive smoothing may lose some details whilst making it quieter. Proper smoothing can reduce abrupt force feedback output. So if you are finding that your force feedback is feeling a little bit robotic, which is certainly one thing that I felt was noticeably improved on these new Evo bases compared to the old Alpha bases, then you can wind this up a little bit. But I actually found that low values here were absolutely fine because the characteristics of the bases are fundamentally more smooth and less robotic than what we had before. But you can of course experiment with that to your heart's content. That is what that setting is intended to do. Then we've got vehicle settings here. So wheel rotation speed. This is going to be how fast the steering wheel can rotate to react to force feedback changes. So 100% allows for maximum rotation speed, but can make the wheel feel a little bit unstable, or even sometimes a little bit too responsive. Lower values produce a more stable wheel at the cost of responsiveness. This setting isn't affected by other parameters. So for things like drifting, for example, if you're finding that you're having trouble catching the car in a slide and controlling the slip angle, then you may want to play around with the wheel rotation speed, just to make sure that the way the car is actually hooking around matches how quickly the wheel is responding in game. I found the default settings here for most profiles are pretty good, and we will talk about the profiles in just a moment as well, because I actually think they've done a really good job with the profiles that we have here, which I can't say for a lot of other brands. So then underneath that, we have feedback detail, which enhances force feedback from the road surface and vehicle suspension. 0 is off. Higher values give more information, but may increase noise and heat while driving. So look, I tend to run this on the lower side. This preset for Assetto Corsa Competizione does have it cranked up quite a bit. It's going to depend on the game that you're running. Some games do a better job of giving you that track surface detail. Some sim titles do a better job at this than others of providing that detail in the first place. But you can think of this as almost like an amplifier or a multiplier for the detail that's already there. So if the detail just isn't there in the first place, all you're going to find is that by cranking this up, you're going to end up with a robotic feeling wheel, which isn't really ideal. So if you are finding that the track surface detail is there, but it just feels a little bit too weak or understated, then cranking this up a little bit may well help you to bring out some of that detail to the point where you feel comfortable with it. But if the detail just isn't really there in the first place, then there's not really going to be a whole lot to work with. So I would recommend starting off with a low value here, maybe 0, and then slowly working your way up until you're comfortable, rather than the other way around. So then over on the right hand side here, we have our mechanical adjustments, and you'll notice we've got a tab here for frequently used as well as other effects. So these other effects are more related to modifiers for game force feedback signals rather than driver level adjustments. So we've got things like mechanical centering, center damper, game inertia, game centering, game damper, and game friction. Under most scenarios these days with all the modern sim racing titles and most simcade games as well, you can just leave these alone. Basically, the mechanical center and center damper are going to be effects that sort of come in over the top of what the game is outputting, and most games are going to handle these inherently within their own software anyway, so you won't need to have these in addition. And then your game inertia, game centering, game damper, and game friction are just modifiers for the signals coming out of the game. So 100% here means that what the wheelbase is going to do matches what the game is telling it to do. If you crank this down, it's like cranking down the volume on those effects. Cranking it up is going to amplify those effects even further, or crank the volume up further. So yeah, I would recommend just leaving these alone unless specifically instructed to do otherwise. But we're going to go back to frequently used here. So next up we have our dynamic prediction level, which is the other new filter we referenced earlier. So this is like the interpolation filter that we see in a lot of other brands' ecosystems these days. And if we hover over the tooltip here, the dynamic prediction level is designed to predict the next state of the vehicle and force feedback in the game based on data from previous moments, such as vehicle speed, steering angle, road surface feedback, feedback, etc., by pre-calculating and simulating to optimize the response of the force feedback. Note that value too high may cause noise or high frequency vibration. So essentially what this is going to do is try to make the force feedback feel a little bit more responsive by sort of preempting what's going to happen next based off previous data. I think that tooltip does a pretty good job of explaining it. So look, under most scenarios, I was perfectly happy just leaving this on 0, to be honest with you, because I felt like the base was really responsive and doing everything that I needed it to do anyway. And cranking this up kind of just started to make it feel a little bit, not necessarily robotic, but a little bit unpredictable. So, I mean, again, you can experiment with this and tweak it to your heart's content. But for me, I didn't really feel the need to run that. And I think that's probably a good thing, because it means that inherently the software and the hardware is actually doing a good job. It's not relying on a lot of artificial stuff to bring that detail out. So then below that, we've got mechanical damper, mechanical friction, and mechanical inertia adjustments. So mechanical damper is going to basically just soften down the force feedback, make it feel a little bit less robotic and sharp if you feel the need to have that. I like to run this at around about 20, which is probably a little bit on the high side. Some people complain that my settings are often a little bit too muted for them, but this is just the way I like to have my steering feel. Mechanical friction is going to be the sensation of weight or mechanically being connected to a steering rack inside the car, so it's going to make the wheel feel a little bit heavier on rotation. And mechanical inertia is going to again sort of contribute to that sensation of being mechanically connected to something. So as you turn the wheel, it's going to feel like it's sort of trying to continue to turn a little bit or have some inertia. And then we've got our slew rate control here, which is going to adjust the responsiveness of the wheel overall. So what I would recommend here is have that turned off to begin with. And then if you're finding that the wheel does feel a little bit too snappy for you, you can start to wind this up. Slew rate is basically just a measurement of how quickly the motor is able to respond to a signal. So if you're finding that it's just way too snappy and way too lively, then yeah, winding this up is going to mute things down a little bit. So you're kind of going to want to play around a little bit here with these various different settings just to get it to feel the way that you like. I would generally recommend start to play around with slew rate control before you start to wind up your mechanical damper too far, because winding up the mechanical damper is going to dampen everything down more than slew rate will. Slew rate is going to control just that sort of super sharp responsive type effect more so than the mechanical damper will. So again, play with it to your heart's content, but that would be my personal recommendation there. And then over on the far right-hand side here, you'll see another whole new section here for ring light settings. So we've got an adjustment for the brightness for the ring light on the front of the wheelbase that we were looking at a little bit earlier. And then we can have that light react to all these various different telemetry-based bits of information depending on our personal preference. And just like what we see in Fanatec's Fanalab software, you can actually drag the hierarchy around for this as well. So whatever is sitting at the top is going to be displayed first, and then it's going to fall down below that. So traction control is going to take preference at the moment, then ABS, green flag, white flag, and so forth. So you can switch these on and off individually or adjust the settings pertaining to each one too. So you can adjust the color based off your personal preference, whether you want it to blink and how quickly you want it to blink as well. And you can click on the little play button here as well to actually test each one of those effects. And there is a little tooltip here for each one, as well as the ability to delete effects if you don't want them. And of course you can add them back in again based off the list of all the different options available here if you wish to do so. So look, I mean, at first it did seem like a bit of a gimmick here. To be honest with you, in the seating position that I have with most steering wheels, I can't actually see the ring light past the wheel anyway, but it does tend to, at least if you're in a dimmed room, sort of glow around your rig a little bit. So, you know, you may find that it's something that's useful for you, and you do have the ability to switch it off entirely if you wish to as well. So then lastly, I just want to quickly go through profiles as well. So you can see at the moment, our current profile is Assetto Corsa Competizione. We do have the ability here to reset a profile if we've made adjustments. We can also save and import profiles too if we wish to do so. So we can import from a local file here. If we click on expand presets here as well, you can see there are pre-cooked presets for a whole variety of different sim racing titles. And as I alluded to earlier, I actually felt like these were pretty good. In the past, I've been quite harsh on some other brands for having crappy presets that give people a pretty bad experience out of the box, but I didn't really feel that that was the case here. I thought that these were pretty good as a baseline, and then you can just tweak based on what we've been discussing to your own personal preference. But yeah, great to see that they've put the time in to set these up. So all you need to do is just click on the one that you want to use. And if you have made any adjustments to the preset you already have loaded, it will prompt you to save those settings before overriding them if you haven't already done so. So that's a nice little touch as well. So yeah, look, I mean, overall, I think it's very well presented. It's obviously come a very long way since our initial Simagic reviews many years ago now. And yeah, I think they've got all the bases covered here. It does all the things that you're likely to want it to do. It's nice and accessible. It's not overwhelming. All the settings are very nicely explained. And yeah, I have really nothing to complain about at all. I think it's really well executed. Okay, so now you've got an objective overview of the hardware, the features, and the software side of things. Let's take a more nuanced look at what this stuff is actually like to live with and drive with day to day. Now, I've been driving with these bases for a number of weeks now, on and off switching between different ones, and I've actually taken the time over the last week. It actually worked really well. Tom took a week off to spend some time with his kids, and I spent pretty much the entire week just going through all the wheelbases that we have here in our inventory again, making sure that I was running on the latest drivers, latest firmware, making sure I was establishing a nice clean baseline of comparison across pretty much everything that we've reviewed historically here on the channel. So what I'm going to be doing now is taking you through my observations, my subjective opinions based on the driving experience that I've had over the last couple of weeks that I've been using all of these and everything else, to sort of go alongside the objective stuff that we've already taken a look at to help you guys, make your own judgment on whether you think these things are going to be right for you. So there's a couple of really important things that I think we need to sort of establish here right from the get-go. The first being that, honestly, everything is pretty good these days. And you've heard me say that before. There isn't a massive difference between the quality of force feedback between, relatively entry-level stuff and the super high-end stuff these days. Really what it comes down to, just overall strength aside, is pretty subtle stuff like how robotic the wheel feels, how responsive it feels, whether it's grainy, whether it's smooth. So historically with Simagic bases and Moser bases as well, this is something you've heard me say in reference to Moser quite recently, there's always been a bit of a game of trade-offs. So in terms of the quality of the force feedback, if you're the sort of person that wants a really nice smooth experience, you would have to make some sacrifices in terms of filtering and filter out some of the more granular detail, which would start to make the base feel a little bit robotic overall. So the more detail you had, the more robotic the force feedback would feel overall. And it was always a bit of a trade-off between the two. Now, immediately upon driving with all three of these bases, the first thing that I noticed is that that wasn't so much the case anymore. And that was the case across all three bases, comparing them with their Alpha counterparts as well. So the Alpha U, the Alpha, and the Alpha Mini. So yeah, with these new bases, you don't have to sacrifice that granular detail, that really sort of responsive detail stuff like track surface, ripple strip textures when you run off onto the grass or the gravel, things like that, in order to have a smooth overall experience. So definitely feels like a more refined driving experience overall, but we are talking about subtle differences here. I'm certainly not going to say that if you already own an Alpha or something else, you should rush out and buy this. What I'm saying here is that overall, objectively from what we've already looked at in the video and subjectively in terms of the driving experience, these are better quality products across the board, no matter which way you try to look at them compared to Simagic's earlier products. So is it worth selling an existing Simagic product? I would say if you own an M10, the old base that has since been discontinued, it really is, night and day difference between the two. If you were upgrading from the M10 to the Sport, for example, you're going to be absolutely blown away with how much better it feels overall. It's not going to feel stronger, but definitely more refined, more detailed, and more responsive, which are all things that are conducive to driving more quickly and more consistently in sim racing. If you already own an Alpha base, an Alpha U, an Alpha, or an Alpha Mini, look, you're not going to be absolutely blown away by the differences here. It is subtle. Is it worth the extra? It's ultimately going to depend on how much you can get secondhand for the old bases. I mean, obviously the value of those is going to drop quite significantly when people realize that these bases are objectively better than the older ones were. But, again, we do have to put it in the correct context here. It's not a massive, massive, massive difference between the two. All I can really say there objectively is that I did find it a little bit easier to catch slides, and I did find drifting was a little bit more intuitive with all three of these bases than their Alpha counterparts. And I think that's just down to, again, that responsiveness and that level of detail and the lack of sacrifice in terms of filtering that was previously a factor. Now, with regards to the new interpolation filters that we were talking about before with these bases, I don't know whether they're going to apply those to the old Alpha bases. If they do, potentially we might be able to bring out a little bit more detail and get rid of some of that sacrifice, but I can't see them doing that. I would imagine that they want people to have a reason to upgrade to these, so they're probably going to keep that as a point of difference, but I can't guarantee that, of course. But yeah, look, I think if you are in the market to upgrade, you're certainly not going to be disappointed, but just don't expect it to be an absolute night and day difference between an Alpha and one of these new Alpha Evos. So what about in comparison with the rest of the market? And I've been thinking about the best way to articulate this for about a week now. The best way I can explain this is forget about the pricing here for just a moment and assume that these are in line with best in class at any given Newton meter level. So, we're comparing these in terms of the driving experience and the build quality, to be honest with you guys. with the best of the best. So we're talking Simucube 2, we're talking, you know, your Acertec La Prima, your Forte, and your Invicta. We're talking your Fanatec Club Sport DD and DD Plus. Those are all sort of best in class products, at least in my experience testing these things out. And then of course you've got your less mainstream brands like VRS, for example. And we will actually be testing out the new VRS wheelbase very, very soon. So make sure you're subbed so you don't miss out on that. But yeah, look, I mean, comparing Newton meter for Newton meter, all three of these bases are every bit as good as any of those other top tier wheelbases that cost, you know, significantly more than this. So for example, the Evo Standard, which comes in at 12 Newton meters, is a very similar driving experience overall to the Acertec La Prima, for example. And when you step up to the Pro at 18 Newton meters, that is a very similar driving experience to the Simucube 2 Sport, for example. So that is the kind of level in terms of quality of detail and force feedback and driving experience that you can expect from all three of these products. Then of course you have the Sport, which sits at a lower tier in terms of overall strength, but is definitely a more refined driving experience overall than something like a Moser R9 or even something like a CSL DD, for example. Smoother, more granular detail, and just objectively a better quality product with a subjectively better driving experience as well. So that's where I would place all three of these bases cost aside. And then once you factor in the price point as well, I mean, you guys don't need me to tell you, these are exceptionally good value for money in all three cases. And yeah, I honestly really can't fault them there. I just wish that they had that native console compatibility. I think if they could nail that side of things, they would have an absolute killer product here. And then you've also got to factor in the wider ecosystem here as well. That's something that we haven't really talked about a whole lot here yet in comparison to competitor products. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. What I would recommend you do is go and watch our direct drive buyer's guide video. That gives you a really good fundamental understanding of every single brand's ecosystem, what kind of products they have to offer within those ecosystems. The two main takeaways here, I would say, are firstly, the barrier to entry in terms of the cost of the quick release. Buying wheel side quick releases for your third-party wheels that connect to your PC through other means, so aren't needing to make use of the electronics in the bases. You're going to be spending a fraction for a D1 spec quick release for the wheel side compared to what you'd be paying for something within the Acertec ecosystem, the Fanatec ecosystem, and so forth. You know, Fanatec used to be able to get away with locking out their force feedback and forcing you to use their own first-party quick releases. With this kind of competition, I really think they're going to need to rethink that, because that's going to be a big reason for people to come across to this ecosystem from the Fanatec ecosystem, I think. But yeah, look, that is a big advantage of both Simagic and Moser compared to a lot of the competitor products out there. So that's definitely something that you absolutely should be considering. And then look, the ecosystem of Simagic's own products is absolutely fantastic as well. Honestly, it blew me away when I jumped back into reviewing Simagic stuff again after a bit of a break. You know, the last thing that we'd reviewed had been the M10, and they didn't really have any other accessories other than just a couple of wheels. And then we jumped back in, we took a look at their H-pattern shifter, we took a look at their hydraulic handbrake. And look, those things are more pricey than what you would find within the Moser ecosystem or even the Fanatec ecosystem to some extent at least. But they're all really fantastic products. So I think really what it's going to come down to there is take a look at the wider ecosystem of products, remembering that, of course, on PC, you can run any brand that you want. So you're not forced into using Simagic's own hardware for any particular reason other than just simplicity if you wanted to keep everything within the one software package like what we looked at before. But yeah, look, I mean, you are going to be paying more for a Simagic shifter, more for a Simagic handbrake than you would be for a Moser or in some cases a Fanatec one, but they are better quality products overall, in my opinion at least, and I think objectively we've demonstrated that as well through our review videos that we've done of those. So look, honestly, having spent the amount of time that I've spent on all three of these bases now, the literal only complaint that I have in terms of the hardware is just that I don't like the fact that they took away that front mount. I'm not a huge fan of active cooling because it is a potential point of failure. You know, we've all seen those kinds of blower fans that we looked at earlier fail over the years or get noisy. In fairness, I never actually came across a scenario, even testing these bases at full strength for extended periods of time, where I even noticed that that fan was running. And look, really the only other thing is just I wish so much that they had native console support. I really do hope that that's something that we see into the future. I did have a good look here and there wasn't any hidden PlayStation security chips or anything like that that I could see. So if PlayStation compatibility were to happen down the line, it would have to be, at least from what I can see, a separate model similar to what we see in the Fanatec ecosystem. As you guys might know, Xbox compatibility does tend to come from a chip within the actual steering wheel. So they could potentially release an Xbox compatible wheel like what we saw with Moser that unlocks Xbox compatibility for all of their bases. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. But yeah, look, honestly, I could go on all day about the experiences that I've had with these things. You know, we put them through their paces, you know, drifting, rally driving, pretty much everything, and there wasn't a single scenario where they didn't perform excellently. One of the complaints that we've had in the past with SIMAGIC is inconsistencies between driving experience with different sims. So often you'd have to use very different settings for different sims to get a similar feeling. I mean, look, honestly, just firing these things up and driving without even touching the settings in most cases gave a very good experience and a consistent experience across all the different sim titles that we tested with as well. So that wasn't really a complaint either. Yeah, I'm really impressed with these, and that's before you even factor in the price. Honestly, the price point on these things is ridiculously cheap. So we talked about how the experience compares Newton meter for Newton meter against the more premium end of the sim racing market. Now, because those high-end brands like Simicube, Acertech, for example, don't currently have anything that sort of lines up with the sport model in terms of strength, at least, how do I feel about this guy? So a lot of people are comparing this with something like the Moza R9, for example. I would say that objectively and subjectively, this is a better experience overall. Objectively, a better quality hardware build, better quality componentry. The software experience is objectively better as well. Moza have been making a few misses recently in the software department. You know, they've always been pretty strong in terms of having a really wide and rapidly expanding ecosystem, but recently a lot of their software updates have broken features, you know, fundamentally changed how products operate. You know, sometimes we've found that we'll try to update something and it bricks and we have to spend a couple of hours trying to recover it. And it just hasn't been a very refined experience recently. I feel like Moza need to slow down a little bit on the development and just focus on getting what they've already got refined and perfect before, you know, developing anything else. So I'd say that, yeah, overall, this is a much more refined product and the driving experience is more refined as well. So I would definitely be recommending this over the Moza R9 at this point in time. Just, of course, factor in the cost of accessories if you're wanting to keep everything within one ecosystem, because, of course, Moza do have some more entry-level shifters, handbrakes, and things like that than what you're going to be looking at if you're buying SIMAGIC counterparts. So be mindful of that. So lastly, what about if you've already decided that you definitely want one of these? Which one is going to be the best value for money for you? So this is where things get a little bit difficult, because honestly, the driving experience, strength aside, between the sport and the standard is pretty much identical. I couldn't really identify anything different. Really, it just comes down to that dynamic range as we were discussing before. So the more dynamic range you have, the more scope you have to generate a variety of different effects from weak through to strong within that dynamic range. So what that means is if you've got a completely linear output from your game, so the maximum you've ever got is 9 Newton meters to output in a crash scenario of hitting a wall or something, then ultimately that's going to trickle down. So weaker effects like running up over ripple strips or cornering forces and so forth aren't going to feel as strong either. Now you can work around that by having a non-linear response, so you bring up the amplitude of those weaker effects and then you have a smaller gap between, you know, those effects and things like crashing, for example. But ultimately, the more dynamic range you have available to you, the more scope you have to generate the variety of different effects and keep those feeling realistic. So, you know, it's not all just about, you know, how much strength you can tolerate. But that said, like we were saying before, you know, I don't generally run even my most powerful bases any more than about 14 Newton meters, because that gives me all the dynamic range that I'm ever going to personally need to experience. So look, if you're a really strong person, you probably are going to find that the 9 is a little bit on the weak side for you. Look, if you're upgrading from something like a Logitech G27 or something like that, G923 or whatever, you're going to be absolutely blown away with this thing, and it's going to feel every bit as strong as you could ever want. But, you know, it is something that ultimately down the line, if the bug bites, you probably will ultimately want to upgrade from at some point. Whereas if you step up from the 9 Newton meter to the 12 Newton meter, you're less likely to ever feel like you're going to want to upgrade into the future. Now, where things get complicated is the jump from the 12 Newton meter up to the 18 Newton meter Pro does come with a couple of noticeable upgrades in performance, strength aside. So obviously you've got more dynamic range available there, as we were discussing. But what I found is that this also seems to feel a little bit more responsive and a little bit more lively in the hands as well. I found, you know, for drifting in particular, I was able to catch those slides and transition just a little bit more intuitively with this base than I was able to with the other two. Now, I was absolutely fine with the other two, but I did find this one to be just a little bit more responsive. Even things like losing the back end of a rear engine Porsche, I was able to control those slides a little bit better with this base than I was able to with these bases, even running similar settings. And I did experiment extensively with those settings to see if I was missing anything there, and I could tune these to feel more like this one does. It does just appear to be a limitation of the motors that we have in these two compared to this one. So spending that extra is going to get you more dynamic range, but it is also going to get you a slightly more responsive and slightly more reactive wheel as well. So look, at the end of the day, I don't want to come across like I'm recommending that everybody goes out and buys the Pro. That's certainly not the case. I think you're going to have an absolutely awesome experience with these two as well. And look, if the 9 is the best that you can possibly afford, you're going to absolutely love it. You're going to be blown away with how good it is, and you know, you're going to be absolutely satisfied. So it's certainly not the case where you're going to be, you know, get this thing home and go, oh, I wish I'd bought the Pro. I wish I bought the Pro, and be disappointed with it. That's just not going to happen. And the other important thing there as well is that there isn't a downgrade in the quality materials or the build quality or anything like that. The cheaper you go in the lineup, they are all built identically, as you saw earlier as well. So it is just purely down to the driving experience here. And yeah, look, across the board, this does provide a better driving experience. But we are really talking about subtle details here. But look, I would put the Pro in line with the best of the best when it comes to any other brand's wheelbases. Running at the same kind of strength levels here. So for me, 14 Newton meters. I set this to 14 Newton meters. I set my SIMAGIC EVO Ultimate to 14 Newton meters. I set my Acertec Invicta to 14 Newton meters. And this feels every bit as good as any of those ones do, which I honestly did not expect for the money. And at the relative strength levels, these guys are every bit as good as the competition, if not better as well. And honestly, guys, it's as simple as that. I'm honestly blown away with how good these things are for the money. And when you factor in the wider ecosystem as well, like I said before, the cost of entry with the quick release has been relatively cheap. The expanding ecosystem that they have as well. We've reviewed a couple of their wheels recently too, particularly the Neo wheel, which I still think is one of the best bang for buck wheels in all of sim racing. Even if you don't have a Simagic wheelbase, it's just an absolutely fantastic wheel for the money. We haven't even looked at it in today's video. We'll look at it in a future video, but they've got their new hubs as well. This is actually a Fanatec Sparko replica rim that we've got mounted to this Simagic plate here. But look, these are really excellent as well. And yeah, look, I just feel like they're ticking all the boxes at the moment. The only box they haven't ticked is just that native console compatibility. And yeah, if they can get native console support across the line, then if I were Fanatec, I would be extremely nervous as well, because that really is the only missing piece of this puzzle at this point. These are very, very good products and exceptional value for money. And it is as simple as that, guys. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do hit the thumbs up button. Make sure you check out those links down in the description below, or check out boostedmedia.net for all the relevant discount codes and affiliate links. That's an awesome way of helping support the channel and saving yourselves a little bit of money in the process as well. But yeah, if you have any questions or anything like that, let us know in the comments down below. I've tried to cover everything as much detail as I can and keep the video as short as I can too. But if there is anything that I've missed or anything you want more detail on, let me know and we'll do our absolute best to make that happen. But yeah, these are every bit as good as I had hoped that they would be. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again next time. Bye.